But I'm going to dive right into our lesson. Look at the text here, please. Genesis chapter 1, and in verse 1, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The earth was formless and void, and darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was moving over the surface of the waters. Then God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. God saw that the light was good, and God separated the light from the darkness. God called the light day, and the darkness He called night, and there was evening, and there was morning, one day. So it began, at least according to this book. This is what this document that we call the book of Genesis is telling us. That God exists and that He's the one that caused all of this to be. This creation is a result of Him and His power being spoken. How do we know that that's true? Is there any evidence that we can look at to decide whether or not we should believe the claims of the Bible? I believe there are several arguments that lead us to believe that God exists. We're not going to try to look at all the arguments that are out there. I'm going to give you one simple argument this morning. And I'll give you 3 examples to illustrate that argument, and then we'll talk about 2 other things at the end. But this one simple argument is what we're going to focus on this morning. But before we even get to that, we have to understand that we cannot study God like we study other things. We cannot get God in a laboratory and measure Him. If He exists, if this book is true, it says that He is Spirit, John 4 and verse 24. So we can't get Him in a lab, we can't weigh Him, we can't measure Him, we can't do things like we would with a physical object and know God in that sense. So can we know God exists? Well, not if that's what you mean. But I do believe we can know something about God. And thinking about creation, as we've read here in Genesis chapter 1, that's an historical event. How can you know any historical event is true? Well, you can't really go back in time and observe a historical event. So can you know that that happened? Well, think of it this way. Can you know that George Washington existed? You don't see him today. What's your proof, right? Well, to know something like that, or to come to believe that George Washington existed, you just go by the data that you have today. You've got historical testimony, you've got artifacts left behind. I don't know, there's probably his house somewhere, people that knew him and wrote about him, stuff that he wrote. There still exists. There's a lot of data like that we look at that leads us to believe today, okay, I don't see George Washington, but I believe that he existed based on all the evidence that's before. That's the logical conclusion to come to. And I think we can do that with God and with a historical event like creation. What's the evidence that's there that would lead us to believe logically He must exist, this must have happened? And I'm not a scientist. We're going to be talking about several sciencey things today. I'm not trying to pretend to be a scientist. In fact, just the opposite. I'm coming to you as a layperson. And I'm just showing you what anybody can read, go watch videos, read some books, see the evidence that's out there about God. And we're trying to present it in that way. And I encourage you to go and investigate more on your own and build your faith based on the things we talk about this morning. Here's the argument that we want to deal with this morning. Design implies a designer. Turn now to the book of Romans, please, chapter 1. And I believe this is the argument that's being made here by Paul by inspiration in Romans 1. Starting in verse 18, Paul wrote, "For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men who suppress the truth in unrighteousness. Because that which is known about God is evident within them, for God made it evident to them. For since the creation of the world, His invisible attributes, His eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood through what has been made, so that they are without excuse." Now, verse 20 is really what we're focusing on. There He is. His eternal power, His divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood through what has been made. So we look at what has been made, we look at creation, and that implies there's some intelligence behind that caused that to be. That's the best explanation to fit the things that are created, the things that we see. That's the argument there. So it's an argument that appeals to common sense. That if we come upon something designed, there had to have been a designer that caused this to exist. That's the simple argument. If you understand that, you've got the lesson right there. And the old classic illustration was if you're walking along a beach, there's a watch in the sand, then that implies that there was a watchmaker. And that's where originally that came from. You would not come up with this outlandish idea that maybe the sand particles and the wind, everything kind of came together and the lightning struck it, gave it an electrical pulse, and no one would think that. Somebody dropped their watch. this was a design thing, an engineered thing, and it fell in the sand. That's what you would assume. We're using that same logical, rational line of thinking to come to this conclusion about God. Wouldn't it be sensical to infer that an intelligent designer caused all of these things that we see around us? All right, let me give you 3 examples that hopefully will stick in your mind. The first one is this guy named Johnny Matheny, who has this bionic arm. Doctors and engineers nowadays creating these amazing prosthetics for folks. So this is Johnny Matheny. He lost his arm to cancer a few years ago. He was the first person in the world to live with an advanced, mind-controlled robotic arm. This thing is hooked up to his brain somehow. Don't ask me how, but it's hooked up. He gets those, you see those little black things on his arm there? He had surgery to get his arm prepared for this, and somehow they get the brain waves to transfer to this prosthetic arm. He thinks about it and he moves those fingers. He moves that arm. It's amazing. A great feat of engineering and cutting edge technology today. Got this in December of 2017. He's been kind of the guinea pig. Johns Hopkins and a bunch of other bright people working on this project to bring about this emerging technology. You need to go home and Google this guy, Johnny Matheny. You can watch YouTube videos of him playing the piano, gardening, and everything, using these fingers on this thing. It's an amazing thing. Of course, the arm is full of problems. There's been several iterations of this. This is not the current one, but he sent it back in for repairs several times as things have gone wrong. They've readjusted it. One of the videos I watched was of him video chatting with a software engineer who is working out the kinks in the software code that controls the arm and getting that stuff tinkered with and getting all the bugs out of that. So here's my question. This is why I bring it up. What's your reaction? You look at that bionic arm. Would you immediately infer that that's designed or not designed? Did those parts just somehow accidentally assemble themselves, or was this something that bright minds brought together in a great feat of engineering? Well, obviously, everybody admits and knows that this was designed. Everybody in the world agrees with that. It's an amazing feat of engineering and medical science. It took tens of millions of dollars, by the way, to bring this together. Some of the brightest minds on the planet building this piece of machinery. Okay, what about this arm? This, of course, is a regular old arm. And yet, it's more advanced than the bionic arm. It has a sense of touch, for example. You touch it, you can feel things with a regular arm. It's got other abilities, such as it doesn't need batteries like the bionic arm does. Maybe one day they'll hook it up to the body's energy system, but now it needs batteries. And the regular old arm has some healing abilities. You cut that arm and it's going to heal. First of all, it's going to bleed and it's going to clot the blood at the site of the cut, which by itself is pretty amazing. The blood doesn't clot all through your body, just right there where you need it. And then the immune system kicks in, it fights off infection there. And after a few days, that cut healed. Bionic arm can't do any of that stuff. Amazing, right? These amazing systems in this regular old arm. Pretty impressive because the multi-million-dollar arm can't do any of that stuff. So you see where we're going with that argument? If the one on the left is obviously designed, what about the one on the right? Can we admit that some designer designed? That's a logical, rational conclusion to come to. It's more advanced than the one that we all admit is designed. It's not some biased assumption. We're trying to get God in there through some kind of bias and just insert him into the equations. That's just a rational inference based on our experience. That's what we would think when we look at that bionic arm, wouldn't we? And so that's a rational thing to infer. Nobody sees that bionic arm and think, well, I guess maybe an explosion happened in a factory somewhere, it kind of blew all those parts together. Nobody would say that, right? Nobody is thinking that. Why would we not infer intelligence when we look at the design of the human body? That's a rational thing to infer. What else would we conclude when we see that cutting-edge technology that is outperformed by nature? Does that make sense? That's an example I hope that will stick in our mind. The Scripture says, I will give thanks to you, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Wonderful are your works, and my soul knows it very well. Psalm 139 and verse 14. Remember again the argument in Romans 1:20. His eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood through what has been made. All right, that's example number one. Here's example number two. How about a book? Here's an average book, but what is it composed of? It's just a bunch of letters on pages, right? But what makes that meaningful is the arrangement of those letters. You put certain letters in a certain order, you got a word. Space, you put another word, and you form those into sentences and then the paragraphs. And so the arrangement of all those letters and words and sentences makes this a meaningful thing. We would all admit again, this is something that is designed, that some intelligent person put all those letters in that arrangement, and now it's a meaningful thing. And so we call that person an author. We all understand that. Well, what about DNA? DNA, as Dr. Kirkwood says in his book, contains a 6 billion letter code for creating every structure of the human body. So DNA is made of 4 nitrogen base pairs, guanine, cytosine, thymine, and adenine. Easier to just say their first letters, G, C, T, and A. And it's the arrangement of those letters, the arrangement of those nitrogen base pairs that makes DNA helpful and important. The sequence of those bases determines which proteins are exempt. That's just a small snippet on the screen there of how DNA works. So you get those letters in just the right order, and through this fascinating process, RNA, and it's replicated and everything, you finally you get the protein that is created because of the information that's coded into that DNA sequence. And so, again, we would think about the implications of this and the design that's obvious there. You got these 4 base pairs, 3 billion of them from mom, 3 billion from dad, so 6 billion of them together in each cell of our bodies. Excuse me, and we have, they don't know how many, trillions of cells in each of our bodies. And this is true in each living thing, plants, everything that's alive, DNA in the nucleus of that cell. And again, that's meaningful because of the arrangement in precise order of each of these base pairs. How did that order get there? That's our question, right? My brother is a computer programmer. He writes these huge programs of tens of thousands of lines of code. If he's got a semicolon out of place, there's a bug in his program. He's got to go back through there and find where it went wrong. And that's the way it is with DNA. You got something out of order, and you got a problem. You've got something wrong in the body, if it's a human, a plant, whatever's going wrong. That DNA has to be all in the right order. In fact, Bill Gates said this, DNA is like a computer program, but far, far more advanced than any software we've ever created. Everything's got to be just in the right order. It took researchers 13 years to figure out the entire sequence of the human genome. Once they discovered it, just to map it all out and look at the sequence of that incredibly long chain of information. It's in a vast amount of information. So what are the chances that these 6 billion bases would get into just the right order by themselves in each cell of the human body? If we just left them alone, even if you say, they've got billions of years, we'll just let them jumper around for billions of years, and we'll just let them do their thing, what's the chances that they'll get in just the right order? Dr. Stephen Meyer said, the probability of constructing a rather short functional protein at random becomes so small as to be effectively zero. No more than 1 chance in 10 to the 125th power, even given our multi-billion-year-old universe. So here's somebody who believes in a billion-year-old universe, multi-billion-year-old universe. Even then, he says, even factoring in that time, there's just no way it can happen. 10 to the 125. That's a 1 with 125 zeros after it. It's just not going to happen. That's just zero chance of that. So you can see what a problem this is to explain naturally. How could that evolve? How could that come into being without an intelligent mind behind it at some point, causing that DNA to come into place? Francis Crick is one of the guys who figured out that DNA is in that double helix structure. It looks like a twisted ladder. Won a Nobel Prize for that in 1962. He said there's no way DNA could have assembled on its own, and he called it a miracle. He even suggested maybe DNA was sent here from another planet, which is not a lot of people say that, a lot of scientists say that. We went one time to A&M and heard a lecture from a guy who suggested it was from bacteria on a meteorite, and it hit planet Earth and it came that way. But it's out of this world. In other words, we can't explain how it would get here. Must have come from out of this world. An alien sent it or something like that. Here's another one. Francis Collins, head of the Human Genome Project, writer of the book Language of God, is a professed Christian, but evolutionist also, and he understands the improbability of DNA occurring spontaneously as well. He thinks God may have created DNA, placed it on Earth, and then allowed evolution to proceed from there. A lot of interesting things in his quote, but what I want us to see is just that here's these experts in the field, and they're coming up with explanations to try to say, how this got there. They know it couldn't have gotten there naturally. Maybe aliens sent it, maybe God exists and He put it there and then it evolved from there. But what does that tell you if they're coming up with out-of-the-world explanations for how DNA came into being? Think of it this way. If a team of archaeologists came upon an inscription of ancient languages somewhere, what would we rationally infer? If you dug that up in a cave or in a sand somewhere, you would say, well, somebody wrote that, right? I mean, if all you had were a few scratches on a rock somewhere and it kind of looks like maybe that's the letter H, that's one thing. Maybe animals scratched it or something. But if you find the entire works of Shakespeare etched on a cave wall, that explanation goes out the window. You immediately say, who wrote that? Why can't we infer the same thing with DNA? 6 billion bases in precise order. Who wrote that? You ever heard of SETI, S-E-T-I, the search for extraterrestrial intelligence? There was an old movie, Contact, with Jodie Foster along these lines. For decades, the idea is if aliens exist out there, and if they want to communicate with us or anybody, they would probably send radio signals out into space. Some sort of orderly sequence of radio signal, like Morse code through space or something, and they'd probably do that. And so we have, for decades, had these dishes pointed out into space just listening to see if we can hear any kind of orderly information coming through. All they've found so far are these kind of basic pulses coming through, which they think are coming from stars, but nothing really complex or no complex arrangement of information. But think about the idea behind that. If we have a complex arrangement of information, that would imply intelligence. That would imply there's an alien out there that sent that, right? That's the same logic we're working with DNA. Here's obviously an orderly arrangement of information, 6 billion things in order. What can we infer from that then? Intelligence, right? That's exactly what we do with any other thing. This is a rational way to look at it. Back in Genesis chapter 1, again, thinking about DNA and how God wrote this. And there's another snippet on the screen, just a short code. This is for the high-L enzyme. A short snippet of DNA code. All got to be in just the right order. Genesis 1, verse 11, God said, "Let the earth sprout vegetation, plants yielding seed, and fruit trees on the earth bearing fruit after their kind with seed in them. And it was so." Notice, after their kind, they're going to be bearing fruit. Down in verse 20, God said, "Let the waters teem with swarms of living creatures, and let birds fly above the earth in the open expanse of the heavens." God created the great sea monsters, and every living creature that moves, with which the waters swarmed after their kind, and every winged bird after its kind. And God saw that it was good. Notice again, after its kind. Verse 24, God said, "Let the earth bring forth living creatures after their kind, cattle and creeping things and beasts of the earth after their kind. And it was so." Verse 27, God created man in His own image. In the image of God He created him, male and female He created them. God blessed them, and God said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth." And on it goes. This document, Genesis, is claiming to give us the name of the one who made that DNA, which replicates and allows for future generations to produce after their kind. It says God put it there. We have found out a bit of how He did it, and that's DNA molecules. You ever heard of Antony Flew? Antony Flew was a famous atheist, died in 2010, wrote a ton of books, lots of debates. He had a debate in Dallas. He had a real famous debate in Denton back in 1976, I think. Anyway, famous atheist. But before he died, after 50 years of proclaiming atheism, he changed his mind. He started believing that God exists. You know what convinced him? For the most part, DNA. If that sounds convincing to you, it was convincing to this guy that proclaimed atheism for 50 years as well. Changed his mind. He wrote a book entitled "There Is a God: How the World's Most Notorious Atheist Changed His Mind." Here's an excerpt from the book. He says, what I think the DNA material has done is that it has shown by almost unbelievable complexity of the arrangements which are needed to produce life that intelligence must have been involved in getting these extraordinarily diverse elements to work together. Of course, all the other atheists said, he was in his 80s. They said, he's old, he's senile, but he changed his mind. All right, here's example number 3. Look at this boat motor. Here's an outboard motor on a boat. Obviously, it's designed to propel the boat through water. Have you ever heard of a bacterial flagellum? Bacterial flagellum. Dr. Michael Behe is a professor of biochemistry. He turned the evolutionary world upside down a few years ago when he primarily wrote about this in his book called Darwin's Black Box. And he talked about this bacterial flagellum and other examples as well, but this is a little gizmo that sticks out of the back of some bacteria and turns around like a propeller, and it just propels these bacteria through fluid. Tiny little whip that sticks out and spins around is basically what it is. But it resembles a rotary rotor. That's a drawing of it real close up. Those of you who are mechanically minded might appreciate the engineering of what you see on the screen there. Here's the way one guy described it. The flagellum consists of rotor and stator units in the cell membrane, including switching unit, bushing, universal joint, the helical screw, propeller. To generate thrust, the rotary motor is driven by protons flowing into the cell body. The motor then drives the rotation of the flagellum at around 300 hertz at a power level of 10 to the negative 16th watts, with energy conversion efficiency close to 100%. The resulting speed is up to 20,000 RPMs, faster than the speed of Formula One race car engines. I tell you what, we're there at A&M. We got a lot of engineers around there. Very impressive to have that kind of motor that small. You can't even see it. That small, and it's designed, engineered that well. These little things are being studied ever since Dr. Behe wrote about this. You know, evolution's been trying to debunk this and come up with ways that this could have evolved and all kinds of. So a lot of people got their eyes on it. They've been studying it. They've learned a lot more about it since he originally wrote about it. In fact, if you're interested, if you go to that website there, revolutionarybehe.com, if you really want to nerd out on this, you can watch a free hour-long video about the bacterial flagellum. But anyway, one of the guys on the video made this comment, Dr. Stephen Meyer again. He said, the machine in some bacterial systems turns at 100,000 RPMs in one direction, can reverse direction in a quarter of a turn, turn 100,000 RPM in another direction. So again, if we got any engineers in here, you can appreciate the efficiency of a system designed like that. So again, we look at a motor anywhere else, like the back of a boat or a Formula One race car engine turning around. We know it's engineered. What about when we look at this little guy, this bacterial flagellum, more efficient than any engine that we've built so far, and it's only 5 millionths of a centimeter across. Accident or engineered? You know, it's interesting that scholars are looking more at mechanisms like this in nature and trying to replicate what already exists in nature. It's a field of science called biomimicry. The field of biomimicry is growing by leaps and bounds, with research centers being established all over the world, with the express purpose being to mimic the design of nature. The website for George Washington University Center for Biomimetics and Bio-Inspired Engineering explained it this way. Despite our seeming prowess in these component technologies, we find it hard to outperform nature in this arena. Nature's solutions are smarter, more energy efficient, agile, adaptable, fault-tolerant, environmentally friendly, and multifunctional. Thus, there's much that we as engineers can learn from nature as we develop the next generation machines and technologies. Turn over to the book of Job, please. Job chapter 38. You remember at the end of the book of Job, when God starts talking to Job about all these examples in his creation, and how it just demonstrates God's power and God's wisdom in creating all of these things. Job chapter 38, starting in verse 1, the Lord answered Job out of the whirlwind. And he said, who is this that darkens counsel by words without knowledge? Now gird up your loins like a man, and I will ask you, and you instruct me. Where were you when I laid the foundation of the earth? Tell me, if you have understanding. Who set its measurements, since you know? Or who stretched the line on it? On what were its bases sunk? Or who laid its cornerstone when the morning stars sang together and all the sons of God shouted for joy? Or who enclosed the sea with its doors when bursting forth it went out from the womb? And on he goes from there. Skip down to chapter 39. In verse 1, God mentions the mountain goat. Do you know the time when the mountain goats give birth? Do you observe the calving of the deer? Down in verse 5, he says, who sent out the wild donkey free? Who loosed the bonds of the swift donkey? To whom I gave the wilderness for a home and the salt land for his dwelling place. Down in verses 19 and 20, he talks about the horse and his leaping and his snorting and everything. Down in verse 26, he talks about the hawk soaring and stretching out its wings toward the south and the eagle making his nest on high. And it just goes on and on through these chapters. Here's example after example, Job, about my wisdom and my creative power and what I've done and shown you in creation. If Job would have had any clue what he was talking about, God might have said, did you make the bacterial flagellum, Job? I made this little thing, it turns 100,000 miles RPM in one direction, stops and turns 100,000 RPM in the other direction, and you can't even see it, it's so small. An amazing feat of engineering. We could talk about a lot of stuff like that. Let me cover a rebuttal that often comes up with the argument of design. It's the God of the gaps rebuttal. People claim we're committing the God of the gaps fallacy. And so this is the idea that anytime there's a gap in scientific knowledge, that we theists plug God into the gap. We don't know something in science, and so all we do is say, well, that's God. And we explain it and say, well, that's God. And so it's a God of the gaps. We're filling in the gaps in our knowledge by just saying, well, God did that. And so you haven't really proved anything. It's just the God of the gaps fallacy. Well, let's think about that for a second. Go back to the example of the hieroglyphs. This is found somewhere in the sand. We don't know who wrote it. But is it a fallacy to infer that somebody wrote that? That that's not a naturally occurring thing? Every time we observe writing that detailed, that's not a naturally occurring thing, that there's some intelligence behind that? Isn't that a rational conclusion and inference based on the fact every other time we observe writing like that, we know it's the source of intelligence? As Dr. Meyer said, design theorists infer a prior intelligent cause based upon present knowledge of cause and effect relationships. We would not say, for example, that an archaeologist had committed a scribe of the gaps fallacy simply because he inferred that an intelligent agent had produced an ancient hieroglyphic inscription. So we're not committing the God of the gaps fallacy. We're just inferring what we would with anything else that has nothing to do with God. It's a rational way to think. Well, let's talk about bias for a second. If I showed any average person the examples from the left side of the screen today and asked whether they thought that those things were some sort of accident or if they were intelligently designed, what would people say? You know, if they kept saying things like, well, it's possible a tornado went through a medical factory and all those parts came together and made this bionic arm, and lightning struck it and gave it electricity, and it all started. And then the book, the wind blew and some ink spilled and splattered on there and it made all those words just right. Wind blew again, turned the page and did on the next. If they kept saying stuff like that, what would you think? That's crazy. Why would you come up with outlandish explanations for how this came to be instead of just saying, well, obviously it's design. People did those things. Well, if we understand all of that for stuff on the left side of the screen, what about the stuff on the right side of the screen today? Isn't it natural? Isn't it logical? Isn't it rational to understand that those things were also designed? Now, some people, maybe they're not biased, they just never thought of what we're talking about this morning. And I'm not trying to accuse people of bias if you just never thought about it. But there are some people that are definitely biased. And I'm going to put a quote up here in a second that I think shows that pretty well. And this one has some big words in it, and it's hard to get through, but we'll summarize it at the end, so don't get lost. This is evolutionary biologist Richard Lewontin. He said, our willingness to accept scientific claims that are against common sense is the key to an understanding of the real struggle between science and the supernatural. We take the side of science in spite of the patent absurdity of some of its constructs, in spite of its failure to fulfill many of its extravagant promises of health and life, in spite of the tolerance of the scientific community for unsubstantiated just-so stories, because we have a prior commitment, a commitment to materialism. It is not that the methods and institutions of science somehow compel us to accept a material explanation of the phenomenal world, but on the contrary, that we are forced by our a priori adherence to material causes to create an apparatus of investigation and a set of concepts that produce material explanations, no matter how counterintuitive, no matter how mystifying to the uninitiated. Moreover, that materialism is absolute, for we cannot allow a divine foot in the door. Now, like I said, a lot of big words in there. What's he saying? He's saying we have a prior commitment that we're going to explain these things naturally. We look at the world, we look at the universe, we're going to explain it by natural means only. We're not going to investigate the idea that God might have done this. We're only going to look at natural, no matter how counterintuitive, no matter how anything, this is what we're limiting ourselves to. We don't want a divine foot in the door. That's bias. Look in the book of 2 Peter, please, chapter 3. Why would people be biased against accepting things that are very clear? 2 Peter chapter 3, down in verse 7, by His word the present heavens and earth are being reserved for fire, kept for the day of judgment and destruction of ungodly men. Verse 11 says, since all these things are to be destroyed in this way, what sort of people ought you to be in holy conduct and godliness? That's the reason. If God exists, we're accountable to Him. Most people do not want to be accountable to God. And so I hope some of these things stick in your mind this morning. I hope it's enough to make sense. If it makes sense to my simple mind, I know you can get it. And think about how these things that show design show that there's an intelligent creator somewhere who designed them. Appreciate your kind attention this morning.